Hello, and welcome to the No Bad Questions podcast, where I try to learn in a conversational manner by sitting down with people who have interesting careers, important lessons to tell, or inspiring stories. I hope that you learn something too. If you want to support the podcast, please follow or subscribe on your platform of choice. You can also like or comment to boost the algorithms or share out to your network to make sure it gets more views. But ultimately, and what I hope you choose to do, is listen to the very end. With that, we'll start today's podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the No Bad Questions podcast. My guest today is Rick Sofia. Rick has a background in manufacturing for over 40 years, the last 28 of which have been focused on processing scrap plastics. We're going to have an interesting conversation about sustainability and plastic recycling. That focus of his has taken him from using industrial scrap to post-consumer scrap and mixed plastics that end up in a landfill. Only about 8% of the billions made and sold in America is recycled, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Rick has a number of wonderful successes in his career. He's managed 4 startup recycling plants. He has patents both issued and pending for using recycled polymers. He's researched and developed methods for using mixed plastics together and is the only known processor that can make a mixed plastic resin for molding. Some of that is beyond me, but sounds very useful to what we're doing here in American society. He has a BA from Nazareth College in Kalamazoo, Michigan, an MBA from the University of Dayton, and is certified in planning and inventory management. Rick Sofia, thanks for being with me.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, I grew up in the age of the recycle, reduce, reuse mantra, yet I'm reading articles in the last couple years about how we're recycling less than ever in America. And in your bio you said only about 8% of plastics get recycled. So what is going on in the plastics recycling industry?
Well, one of the biggest issues with recycling is being able to get all the material. So if you think about it, if companies that do have scrap, they tend to mix it, they tend to just throw it out and it just gets picked up. And then, so how do people reuse it? And there's quite a talent to be able to reuse it. And there's not really been a focus on that. And if pricing for material for virgin isn't that ridiculous, so then people will just say they want to recycle, but it's not cost effective, so they don't do it.
Mm. And that cost effectiveness that's despite government subsidies, right? I mean, we try not to be political here on No Bad Questions, but there is subsidization for the recycling of plastic. Is that still true, or has that gone away?
Yeah, it's there, but it's not like you think it is. Think about this. You see the floating material in the ocean, and you say, well, why can't they recycle it? Well, they can recycle it, and it's not that difficult, but you got to collect all that material. So the amount of cost just to collect it all, even though you could fill up a truck, it would be so light. There's no density to it. So that's what's hurting people, the collection of it. When they came out with the idea of collecting recycled, and they'd have all the MRFs and the city start doing it, that's a great idea. And that has gone pretty well along. And the people that can separate some of the good stuff out, they will, but all the stuff that's mixed, there's no home for it. So that ends up going to the landfill.
And so is that really where we need, you have a number of technological innovations to your name, but is where we need technological innovation in this space, is it in the collection and sorting and filtering? Is that really where we need technology to help us?
Well, probably the smartest thing that's going on today is called chemical recycling. And that has, if you've read over the last couple of years, that's a big item. And what that does is it takes the plastic almost back to its original position that it was from just a little past oil, so a little bit of a method that they could then make any resin with it. That is great. It costs a lot of money to do that. So if the price of virgin material gets too low, then that's not cost effective anymore. That's one of the main new technologies out there. The normal technology out there was called separation by density. Like everything has density. Some things float, some don't. In propylenes, they're like a 0.90 density. Ethylenes are 0.92. Some are 0.95. So what these companies do is they separate plastics by grinding it, getting in water, adding chemistry to it, and they'll separate by densities. And then basically what they can do once it's separated, they can then make those materials into a reprocessed resin that someone could buy and use. But again, that costs some money, and it's collection and bringing it all in. So if the price of virgin starts just like gasoline goes up and down, so does virgin pricing. So if it goes down, that's no longer cost effective. And there's not really any known that I know of subsidies on that. You can get some subsidies and grants on your processing of it, but still there's a heck of a cost and time to do that. So
yeah. And break down for me and for the audience, when you say, the virgin material, is that oil, or is it something derived from oil? Because I know essentially plastic comes out of oil. It's not what we make into gasoline, but that barrel of oil that we hear the prices, it's $100 a barrel of oil or things like this. Is that what you mean when you say virgin material, or is there something else involved in that?
That's a great point. It's great question you're bringing up. So what happens in oil, you think you get a barrel of oil and then you can let's make it all propylene or ethylene or whatever. It doesn't work like that. In oil, there's different types of oil, and there's some that can be used to make a polymer and some can't be used to make a polymer. There's two basic polymers that come out of oil, a propylene and an ethylene, not to be confused with polypropylene or polyethylene. Propylene and ethylene, then what they do with that is they add catalysts and they add chemistry to it to make the different plastics. The three basic main plastics out there are a polyester, a polypropylene, and a polyethylene. Those are the low-cost items, and they're big volume with them. So when you hold a bottle in your hand that's like a Pepsi bottle or whatever, that's PET, they call it polyester. And it gives you a real strong surface, and that material is a big volume item. So that's how virgin goes up and down. It's based on what oil does go up and down. And then if you notice in the winter when it gets real cold and they need to make a lot of de-icers for the airplanes, they start consuming some of the same material that would be polymer. And then the other part of that is you got to have companies that can take and do, they call it cracking, to be able to make those polymers. So you have to have enough of that capacity out there. So every once in a while when you see the pricing goes way up, they found out that the people that are making the resin, they're down for maintenance, or they had a blow up of something where they can't produce. So it's all supply and demand.
So speaking of supply and demand, I think COVID's given us all some lessons in supply chains. How centralized are these, I'll call them refineries. Maybe that's not the right word, but the refineries that turn crude oil into the ethylene or polyethylene or some of these products that you're talking about? Is there like two of them in the whole world? Because I know we've figured out, all of us together are learning how niche and single threaded some of these supply chains are. Or is this supply chain in plastics fairly diverse?
Well, it's very costly to make one of those plants, and there's many plants that do it, but the volume, I think in the U.S., 150, 160 billion pounds they make every year. So you've got to have a lot of sources to be able to make that kind of volume. So I think there's enough capacity, and you'll always read about new ones opening up, but it's still, you got to be efficient in the crude oil. That price gets too high, then all of a sudden your virgin resin goes up, and then everybody's costs go up. You know what I mean? And so then it works for recycling, because now you can take scrap and you can make resin with it. But if that pricing drops down and it gets, less than, let's say, 60 cents a pound for it, all of a sudden it's not very advantageous to try and reprocess. I'll give you an example. There's a company called PreZero.
Okay.
They're in South Carolina. They just opened this plant there a few years ago. Fantastic. They figured out how to take material that's different densities, separate it out, and make resin with it. They just closed about 3.5 months ago because the oil, everything went down. And so because it went down, the virgin material went down and they couldn't be affected. They couldn't sell what they were making anymore. So here's very simple. Here's how this works. So let's say you have a propylene. Let's say you have a product that is I don't know, maybe just a tote that you buy, a container, an 18-gallon container at Walmart. It's made out of polypropylene. And now you have a bunch of them that are scrapped. And so you want to make something with it. What you do is you take that material, you shred it, you grind it into a small particle, and then you take it through a big heating machine called an extruder. And you extrude that material out and you mix some other materials with it, and it comes out in a small pellet. And when it's in a pellet, that is then fed into injection molding machines to make the same part again. It's really funny. Each time you do a heat rise of polymer, it loses some properties. But if you put an antioxidant in it, it can go forever. You just keep putting it in and it doesn't lose any properties. So recycling really can work. It only becomes an issue when you can't get the material or it's mixed with other materials. Then you need a lot of talent and you have to spend the money of separation. Oh, yeah.
And sorry, so what I was going to say, so the sustainability factor to me is, I'll admit I'm not a big recycler, and but one of the things that I hear about, read about, and I think is worth recycling is things that are finite resources. So metals, aluminum cans, things like that, and plastics, because they're coming from oil. But it's disappointing to hear that even now, 30, 40 years into this industry, that the price points are so challenging. And has it gotten better in your career, or is it the same as where we started?
Oh no, it's way better. It's way better. Let me give you a real success. So Pepsi and Coke got the heck beat out of them about being a big polluter. They're terrible. All this stuff floating in the ocean, it's all their fault. When in reality, it really isn't their fault. And so they've really stepped up an effort. And it's pretty easy to take those bottles that they have and reprocess them. So today, this will shock you, but I think there's like 9 to 10 billion pounds used to make bottles. And you know how much they recycle? They recycle about 3 billion. So that's amazing compared to everybody else, because everybody's focused on those bottles. They have these recycling bottling plants. They bring it in. They have a wash system. They grind it out and they remove the labels from them. And they remake the PET into a bottle. And that's a tremendous success. And my hat's off to those guys. Now, what I started thinking about in my career, okay, so how can I use it? Well, I don't have any money. I'm just a small guy. How could I really make an impact for myself competitively with these type of resins? Take the stuff nobody wants. Well, what wouldn't they want of that? They don't want the label. Well, the label, who'd want a label? Well, that label's plastic. So I get the label. I buy some of that material. And yeah, I can get it for pretty much a couple of cents a pound. But here's the problem with it. It isn't just what's called BOPP, which you print on, which is a polypropylene. It also has some low density in it. It also has some PET in it from the bottle. So it has other polymers mixed in. So unless you have a system to filter those out, a lot of people don't want that material. Our technology was, well, let's find a way to use it. So we developed the technology to be able to use a little bit of that contamination, and that causes a problem. And someone could say, oh, Rick, that's fantastic. You can do it. It doesn't matter if I could do it today and do thousands and thousands of pounds, which I can. Doesn't mean I get business from people. You still have to have all these relationships. You still have to know all these people. You still have to have a way to get that material and get it to you. So there is some great recyclers out there, but only the real big ones seem to make a difference. So let me give you an example of a real big one. KW Recycling. If you look in Plastic News, they're one of the leaders. They bring in materials like that. They've come up with ways to make a product. But again, they separate the polymers out. And that's right. Everyone is at the same point. They're separating the polymers out, or they're chemical recycling. And even the chemical recyclers can only deal with a couple polymers. So the issue has been when the plastics are mixed, it makes it very difficult. And if you're at your house, then you just think about it. So you put in a bag all these different, bottles and stuff you get it. Well, a lot of times they're different polymers. And so when they get to a MRF, people think, oh, the MRF separates. A lot of them don't. They don't want to mess with that. It's too labor intensive. How are they going to do it? They have these sorters or they do it by hand. A lot of them don't do that. They just figure ways to sell it. And if they can't sell it, they just landfill it. I know I said a lot right there, but it kind of points to the problem.
No, that's fine. That ties to, so there's been articles, right, over the last couple of years of I'll call them, I don't know if you want to call them horror stories. That's maybe too strong of a word, but this idea that people are spending effort at home separating out their plastics for recycling, but it ends up in the landfill anyway. And you just described how that happens, right? Is it's not really, it's sorted. The plastic is separate from the refuse, the trash, but it's not really sorted because it's not down to the different polymers, because either somebody at home doesn't know those differences, or just how many containers do you want out on the curb, right? I mean, there's so many reasons why somebody might not, but so then it goes off to a recycler and they're just like, well, we can't afford to further sort these. We'll just dump them. They end up throwing them in the trash. Essentially, they send them to the landfill. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, and I want to hit you with 2 points. So there's certain people that are bigger companies like that have a MRF and they get it in, even though they're mixed. They have a system. They grind the material. They they grind it and they put it in, cleanse it, and then they densify. By density, they separate it. Those guys are making it work. So they're tremendous success. And like Republic just started doing something similar to that, where they have recycling centers so that they can now sell those resins out on the market. And there's other companies that are separating. It's just when they may think they're doing great because they're doing thousands and maybe millions of pounds, but when you talk of 160 billion as a total, that number comes up at maybe 5-6%. That's one thing. And here's something else I want to explain to people that aren't as familiar with this. So when I talk different plastics, so this will help you. So high density polyethylene melts at about 266 degrees, and polypropylene melts at about 338. Polyester doesn't melt till 509. I think nylon's 514. So when people run those in an extruder, they say, well, just take the temperature up so everything melts, right? It doesn't work like that. If you take your extruder temperature up to the 509 for polyester, you've just degraded all the other polymers. That's the problem. They can't handle the heats that you run at these different material types. And because you can't handle them, they can't run them together. And that's one. And so listen, if you look at the technology we've developed, I can pat myself on the back all day. Hey, guess what? I figured a way to use that. But I'm going to stay small. Who's going to be big? And I was going to put any money in investing, it'd be a chemical recycler. Why? Because they are taking it back to a form that then you can build it back to whatever resin you want. So really, they're probably the answer, and that's probably the future. And I imagine if you did some studies, you'd find more and more people are investing and looking at chemical recycling. Even though it does have a cost, and you pointed out, the government probably will do some subsidies in that to help so that it can be competitive even when the market goes down. That would be the real answer.
And so they're taking it back so far in the chemical process that it can be built back up into, I'm going to say whatever. That might not literally be true, but essentially into whatever. And I have to imagine, though, I mean, that has to be both a capital intensive process. I mean, meaning the startup costs have to be huge. So you have to have enormous scale and funding. But also, I would imagine that it's also, maybe I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, energy intensive. You know, a lot of manufacturing processes eat a lot of energy. And so if that's true, what I wonder is, for the sake of recycling these materials, are we then, from a holistic green perspective, are we then burning so much energy over here? And most of the U.S. gets its energy from natural gas and things like that. So we're still using up, natural resources one way or the other. I mean, is it indeed an energy intensive process? And
it's not as bad as you think. It probably isn't that much different than any other process. the advantage of, the
Okay.
problem is a cost. To do all that still has a cost
Mm,
to get all the materials, have them brought in, and then figure out how to separate and how to get them back to the original form. Listen, here's one idea that because there's people probably will think this. Well, why don't you just take this mixed plastic and make a fuel pellet out of it, like kegs of product that
mm,
you could put in and heat up? And they do that. The trouble is that it's costly. And so when I say costly, you can't get that much money for selling that for fuel when you can do fuel other
mm,
places. That's another reason, or you could argue that, hey, it is for the environment because you're using it now for heat or whatever, but that's not really that effective either. The best way to do it is to sell it into a resin that can be made into a part. That's the best way for us.
mm.
Like Pepsi and Coke started doing with the bottles. So now you're getting bottles that are 100% recycled. And guess what? They're just as good and just as strong. So that's pretty cool. And that's
Mm.
one of the advantage plastics has over. If you ever got pad of paper and said use with recycled cardboard or whatever, well, it never works very well compared to you get a recycled plastic. It could be just like the virgin plastic because remember I told you the
Right.
polymer doesn't degrade that much. So there's advantages if you do it right with the plastic.
Right. And do you know much about the microplastics? The news is always looking for stuff for all of us to be afraid of. And the last couple of years, I've seen a lot of articles about how microplastics are in everything. Is this a byproduct from recycling, or is it just as plastics degrade in landfills and they get into the groundwater? Do you know much about microplastics?
No, I don't know anything about microplastic unless
Okay.
it's, here's what I do know. They talk about fish eating plastic and stuff. So as you get it, as
Mm-hmm.
it's fines and stuff like that, it's derivatives from plastics and it can get in your system. Yeah, I know about that. And that is an issue. And that's why
Okay.
collection's so important and closed looping and how you use it is very important.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. And that is what I'm talking about. And like I said, there's been some news articles trying to, everybody should be, I read one that was like, you eat like a credit card worth of plastic a year from eating fish and
Wow,
from eating
that's
this. And I'm
interesting. I
like,
didn't know that.
I don't know if that's true or
Yeah.
not, or just sensationalism, but it's certainly something that grabs the attention and makes you wonder. Right.
One thing I found interesting is
Um,
in Europe, what they do is they give what's called a carbon credit. And so if you're recycling, you get credit.
mm,
So in other words, let's say you have two companies and one company doesn't do any recycling. So they get charged by the government
mhm,
as a penalty. The other company, they recycle, they get subsidy from the government because they do recycle. I thought that was
mm,
pretty good. It's the same thing in California. They started a thing with carpeting. And so what happens every time you buy a new
mhm.
carpet, you have to pay a percent, like 2% or 3% for its once its life's over, where it's going to go. And then what they do is they subsidize people to buy that used carpet and put it into a polymer because it is a polymer to put it into a product. So
Yeah, and I've heard of some of those carbon programs, and I know there's a number of political stances regarding those, so we won't go too
right.
deep on that. But I think there's certainly I think humans follow incentives more than they follow penalties. So
Yeah,
if we can find ways to incentivize people and companies to recycle, that's probably the better way
I agree.
to affect actual behavioral
I think
change.
so. That's a
You
good
know,
point. I agree with you.
um, so let me ask. I wouldn't imagine that your industry is unique amongst others when it comes to workforce shortages. Are you seeing challenges in hiring and getting people to come to work like everybody else in America seems to be doing, or is because it's maybe having an environmental impact and a lot of people have passion for that? Is it something where people pursue that more passionately, and so you're not having some of those challenges that other industries are having?
No, actually, we're having the same issues. It's shocking to me. It's we got a
Mm,
plant in Ohio, in eastern Ohio, and we're making pallets out of mixed resin, and we're so excited about it. We're even taking scrap from customers, putting that in the resin, making a pallet back to them. But trying to find people has not been easy. It's really surprised me.
mm-hmm.
So we have to figure out how to automate
So
more and take less labor out.
Right. Yeah. So I think the automation is, I think everybody in every industry is looking at automation. I live in the healthcare industry, and we're trying to find ways to automate things. And I read an article out of Japan that was going to essentially, I'm going to call it robot nurses. And I read an article out of Michigan that an organization here in the States was going to go virtual nurses. So the nurse might not come to your room unless there's something urgent. Most stuff they're going to, you call them on your screen in the room. So that's just a healthcare tangent, but I think everybody's looking for automation. And then that's just the workers. But then what about the leaders? So, you've been doing this for 28 years, and the plastics recycling and manufacturing for 40. If I do the math on that, you may have some years ahead of you, but not as many as a 25-year-old, right? So do we have enough people coming up to carry the torch, do you feel like? Or is this something that we need to get people more interested in your business?
Well, that's another great question. Look, here's the thing. Smart people come out of college, they don't go into recycled up until recently. Where did they go? They go into the virgin companies where the big dollars are, and the polymer chemists and so on. So that could conclude, well, Rick, you're not too smart then. You didn't go in that industry. Absolutely. And so what happened when I got into the recycling industry, there's no book you can look at. I want to give you a perfect example. This is a perfect example. So I was in a plant, and they were making a resin. And they were using diaper scrap from the manufacturer. And that diaper scrap had polypropylene and polyethylene mixed in it. So I went into the polymer chemist that was doing the formula and said, hey, I'm trying to learn, can you run polyethylene, polypropylene together? And he goes, no. And he goes to the board, he shows me chemically why it doesn't work. Okay. Well, I didn't ask him any more questions after that because I knew that's what he was running, but he didn't understand it. Here's what I found out is that if it's a low density polyethylene and you keep it under like 18%, it'll be fine. It actually operates almost because, okay, so what does that mean? Like a film, like, you go to dry clean, that film stretching, you know what I mean? So it was almost like a trampoline where it would stretch. The polymer would stretch and it wouldn't break. And the propylene was stiff enough to be able to handle everything. So here's two different plastics, but they work. But a polymer chemist on paper is showing that doesn't work. But here's some of me that's practical is figuring out, oh, it does work. And here's the reasons it work. So I went to this Ask the Expert big plastics show, and they were recycling experts, and all of them had different answers. So what I found in 94 when I was doing this and just starting out, I just started talking to people and found there just was a few people in the industry that really understood recycling. Most of the recyclers were just taking one stream of material and just pelletizing or putting it into a pellet. They weren't really putting other materials together. So I've spent just probably years developing and learning and realizing there's no experts to ask. Now, what's different today is that with chemical recycling and other things and recycling becoming such a big issue, there is talent coming into this business. And there's people that are way smarter than me that are looking at it and well, we could do this or we could do that. That's how chemical recycling started. So I think that's encouraging for all of us. That is taken serious now. And people are looking at how do we reuse and how do we not pollute our environment. So I think a lot of for what's going on.
Okay. And so if somebody you're talking about, you were getting started in the 90s and the first half of the 90s. And so if somebody's out there and they're either young and trying to figure out what to do, when they grow up, as you might say, or somebody who's in a mid-career and looking for an industry change or a career change, how do you get started in your world? How does somebody, do they have to go to college? It sounds like they have to maybe know some chemistry, but they don't have to be a chemical engineer from the sounds of it. How does somebody get started in your world?
Well, listen, there's so many recycling companies out there, but here's the sad news. Okay, about a fourth of them go out of business every year. Now that's shocking news. So 25% at least go out of business. Why is that? Because a lot of recyclers are just people, they worked in a recycling factory, they did grinding. well, let's start my own business. They start grinding. They set up recycling. Well, they don't have the support. They don't have the education how you manage something like that. So they go down a path, and then when the market goes down, they go under. But the bigger recycling companies, they're the key guys. They're the mainstay that are here year after year. You can go in Plastic News and get a list of those. So if I'm a new guy that I want to get involved in plastics, you get hired for one of them. It's a lot of training. Instead of a college you're going to school at the plant and learning every day what they do, and you can do what I did. I studied on my own. I would run trials and learn from it and talk to people. And if you did do like a 2-year program at a polymer school, you would learn some real basic stuff that would help you. I think the future is in plastics. I think there's so many things that we aren't even to yet that we can do, and recycling will become a mainstay because you're already seeing the foundation set up for that to become a mainstay. And things will change and they will get better because it's more efficient. A product is lighter, is cheaper, it's better, and you can make it so strong with the plastic. It's just, in a sense, we've been out of control for years because no one thought much about it. And then when you get to these other countries that have no controls, well, just throw it in the ocean, get rid of it, just throw it out, well, that's all changing now, as you know.
Yeah. I've seen a lot on ocean cleanup projects, river cleanup projects. Yeah. I read once that, the top 10 most polluted rivers in the world account for like 50% of the plastic in the ocean. And so if you deploy river cleanup, it won't get to the ocean. And then that gets into what you mentioned earlier. To me, at least, it gets into, the collection and allocation of plastics or other items for recycling. So I definitely enjoy reading articles about some of those efforts and where they might take us in the future. And speaking of the future, I've got this theory. I'm interested to pick your brain on it. I have this theory that at some point when either the oil gets too expensive and maybe that's 5 years from now, maybe it's 50 years from now, but when the oil gets too expensive or the technology in recycling gets strong enough that humanity is going to mine landfills like we mine for coal. Because there's all that plastic there and there's all that other trash. Do you think that I'm crazy, or could you see that in the future one day where that happens, where we go back to where we've dumped all this stuff in a landfill, but it's centralized, it's right there, break out the diggers? What do you think?
Well, I think that's a heck of an idea, but here's what would prevent that. I mean, that would make a lot of sense, but here's what would prevent it. Mm-hmm. Remember the number I told you. Even if I'm off a little bit, it's 140 billion pounds. So much is being produced every year. It'd just be better to handle it rather than trying to go into a landfill and figure out what they did put or didn't put. And then you have all the dirt and all the other things that are there. But just the amount that you could recycle. And there's a lot of ways we could help ourselves. And I think the harder we are on business, what I mean by that harder. So let's say, many companies would make a product and they'd be 95% one polymer and 5% a different. The harder we are to say, hey, that's a mixed plastic, it's either going to be 100% or we're going to charge you a penalty. If you started doing that, what you would force is these companies to make a polymer all the same polymer. And if they made all the same polymer, it's so easy to recycle. Now, listen to me. Someone would argue and they say, Dave, you can't do that because this part needs to be more impact and this needs to be stiffer. Well, guess what? You can take a polypropylene and you can add some rubber to it and make it great impact. And then you could also add some calcium or talc to it and make it great stiffness. And when you melt it all down, it all can be used together because it's the same polymer. So that wouldn't hold. They could do that. And I think that would make a lot of sense. And if I was looking at the PET business, here's what I'd say. I'd get rid of that label. I'd print on the bottle. So now you got one bottle, and the bottle cap would be the same because they're different too. So the bottle cap's different. The liner inside the bottle cap's different. The label itself is different. The print on it. And there's all those factors that are different. That's why you need to put controls. That's where I'd put the controls because then we could recycle so much easier. Help us be easier to recycle. That would make a big difference.
That's a cool idea. I've never thought about that. I never would have if I hadn't talked to you, but that's really interesting. And again, I don't want to go down a political discussion pathway, but I have to sit here and wonder, like, why don't we do that? Would that be a lot more costly to businesses to have to go with, one type of polymer? I mean, or is it really, do they just do it for their convenience?
Well, it's not that. I think it's lack of drive for them. So in other words, if they're making a product, like let's say you go into Walmart, they make 16 to 18 million 18-gallon containers every year. And a lot of times they put a label on them on the outside, and sometimes they'll have a different top than the bottom. It could all be the same resin. Instead of a label, you just print right on it. That ink is not going to be an issue in reprocessing it. It's looking at from cost effective. But if everyone was held to the same rule, it's got to be the same polymer. Now, sure, there's going to be examples, MD, like medical product. There's going to be examples where you can't do that, but then you have to pay a penalty if you can't do that. And so it would serve you to find a way to be able to do it. And just get creative. Listen, companies are very creative. And if they know this is now a new rule, then they could solve it. That's just how it works.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. And
so the reason no one's doing that, Dave, to interrupt you a minute, is because there's nobody driving that. There's no one driving. And government, if you look at the government and what they do, they're jumping on recycling. They don't like it because it's creating all these issues. They don't even understand the real polymers and how it works. There's no champion because there's a lack of education of understanding it all. These companies that are running, they're not out trying to screw anybody else. They're just trying to be competitive, and they're just competing in a world market. So,
right. And it is a global market. I mean, I've read about waste getting shipped across the ocean. That's where a lot of the waste in the ocean comes from is ships, and things like this. So, yeah, the global market is a great point, and what companies could do about it is a great point. Let's wrap with then what individuals. That's what companies can do. We talked a little bit about or alluded to what governments could do, which would maybe just learn a little bit more about it and find some champions. But we learned a little bit about the industry and how it's changed and some of your work struggles and so forth. But what for me, it's pretty easy. I could probably just recycle more. But for others who maybe are already recycling, who are better stewards of their plastics that they use and so forth, is there something that individuals could do to help with, being more green, supporting recycling, supporting sustainability? To your mind, is there one or two, sort of tactical things just the individual person, average person could do to do better in this space?
Well, here's my answer on that. There's a new program called the Hefty Energy Program, and I'm pleased with that. They have a bag, and you as a consumer, you put in non-bottles in that bag, and then you do that for your curbside. And the reason is bottles, like these detergent bottles, they're worth something. That's good material, so that's easy to recycle, and then it keeps the bag separate. So as a consumer, by doing your recycling and following any rules, that's number one. But number two is where you vote. You got to vote for those opportunities that are helping in recycling. And it doesn't hurt for you to even press your. So let's say you have 2 or 3 different companies, Waste Management, Republic, somebody else that can pick up your curbside. Find out which one of them really do something with it. In other words, they're separating out and going places where the other one going to landfill and then use that. I think the more we hold our voice to that, when a company knows you're not going to go with them because they're not doing this, they tend to switch off. Like right now with Republic, Waste Management's a leader. You can bet they're going to be on this real soon, because of their competition is.
Voting with your dollars. I like it. I've always said vote with your dollars when it comes to like restaurants.
Yes.
My family will tell you I'm big on that. I get bad service, I just won't come back. I'm not going to stiff the waitress on her tip or whatever. I'm just going to not come back. I'm going to vote with my dollars. And so I love that tip on do a little bit more research if you've got some options in your area when it comes to who's doing your waste. management, lowercase, not the big company, lowercase waste management at your house. Vote with your dollars. And you said waste management, capital W, capital M, that company's pretty good.
Well, Republic is the one that's started the big recycling.
I'm sorry, Republic
waste
is
management is huge though. And I think you're going to see some changes come from them.
Good. Okay. Well, I hope that I know what we're about at our time here. Rick, I certainly learned a couple things, and I hope listeners did as well as some ideas on how they can contribute to, recycling, sustainability, keeping green. And I just really appreciate you coming on and talking with me here on No Bad Questions.
Yeah, good. Thanks for having me.